Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Thank you for downloading and listening to This Pathological Life. If you're interested in continuing the story, we have a second series called This Medical Life. Please download it and subscribe now.
Dr. Travis Brown, why do we need a podcast called This Pathological Life?
Every disease has its own story to tell, so we're going to tell them.
Dr. Travis Brown, you know that I'm a sucker for a good puzzle, and in this episode we have a genetic puzzle, don't we?
We do. So this is about M.E.N 1, 2, 3, 4, depending on how far you go with it. It's multiple endocrine neoplasia. So we've called this the genetic puzzle, and this is a testament in history to the power of observation. Doctors who right at the time in history recognize something's wrong, recognize a pattern of illness in a patient, but doesn't quite have the technology to say what's wrong with it or the knowledge. And so what it is there's a common saying in medicine that, common things occur commonly. Or when you hear hoofbeats, think of horses, not zebras, or, even further, not unicorns. Mm-hmm. And so the problem is, the challenge is in medicine, sometimes it is a zebra coming along or a unicorn. And how do we manage this? And this is what we find is that, M.E.N is actually quite a hard disease process to get your mind around. The reason that is because the pattern of presentation is so varied. The disease illness itself is so varied. So there's not a really simple way to be able to identify it. And that's why sort of delay in diagnosis takes a long time, and the patients probably have delayed in treatment because of that. But that's not because of anyone's misunderstanding. It's just because it's a hard disease to diagnose. And if we look in the history, we go back to 1903, and there's a few scattered reports of multiple adenomas of endocrine glands in men. And the next 50 years, you see these reports crop up of just these case reports written about unusual tumours in patients. Now, nothing specific. It's when we get to 1954 that we come across a US physician by the name of Dr. Paul Wormer. And he wrote an article called Genetic Aspects of Adenomatosis of Endocrine Glands. And he wrote this in the American Journal of Medicine. And what he wrote is he came across a family. There was a father and 4 daughters who were affected with this illness. Now, there were 5 other children that were unaffected. Now, what he found is these patients had tumours in the anterior pituitary, parathyroid gland, and the pancreas. Now, the pattern, he was clearly took a very thorough history and then started to investigate and say, this is really unusual to get in this family. And he ended up saying this is an autosomal dominant disorder, with most of the patients actually showing some sort of symptoms, or what we say a high degree of penetrance, so it's actually expressing the disease. And the patients also had this odd finding of peptic ulcers. Now, he believed the peptic ulcers were related to different genes, so somewhat unrelated. But 9 years later, he writes another article in 1963, and it's called Endocrine Adenomatosis and Peptic Ulcer in a Large Kindred. And what he had done was he was able to trace 5 generations, even going through to their Italian heritage. He did a family tree, and he had 53 people that he had traced through that. 20 of the relatives had this endocrine adenomatosis, and 19 of 20 of them had peptic ulcers. And so what he found was tumours in the anterior pituitary, the pancreas, and the parathyroid. There are also some other tumours that he came across of, adenomas in the thyroid or lipomas, so fatty tumours, And this other one that just came up and he wrote about, it's called Zollinger-Ellison syndrome. Now, we'll come back to that, but what we're looking at is once he reported it, then other people started to observe and say, oh, I've got this. It's a rare condition, but with rare conditions and someone has written about, then other people start to notice, oh, this is unusual over here in this family as well. And so that takes us from Dr. Paul Wormer to 1955, back again, and we have two surgeons, Zollinger and Ellison syndrome. Now, these two surgeons wrote an article about two female patients that had a rare digestive disorder where their body produced too much acid, and they started getting weird ulcers in weird places in their stomach. Now, it's a surgical article, and they talk about how to bypass the surgery. And then with this, they go to the point of saying, unfortunately, one of the women ended up dying eventually, and she had a pancreatic tumor, an islet cell tumor. And then the second lady, she didn't die of the disease that they know of, but they didn't find any cause for it.
This is amazing. They say that we shouldn't be exploring space because we still haven't finished exploring the ocean. We haven't even finished with the human body yet.
Exactly. And here's the thing. They knew something was odd about this. How does someone produce too much acid and that it starts causing the pathology? And so they wrote about it. Now, this has been analysed because they created a surgical technique that wasn't known at the time, and then surgeons have looked at that and refined it. And so, but that is known as Zollinger-Ellison syndrome, when the body produces too much acid and causing problems for itself. And then we have the third person, his name is Dr. John Sipple, who wrote a report of a patient who was 33 years old. Now, he wrote this in 1961, and these have pheochromocytomas. Now, these are tumours, relative benign tumours, so to speak, in the adrenal gland. But he also noted that this patient who was 33, who ended up dying, unfortunately, also had a medullary thyroid carcinoma tumor. So this patient, who ended up dying, unfortunately, had pheochromocytomas, bilateral in the adrenal gland, which is a benign tumor, but it doesn't necessarily behave benign because the things it secrete make the body have really high hypertension, which causes other problems. And so then this patient also had a thyroid cancer, which they initially diagnosed as follicular, but that year they found a new entity and they called it medullary thyroid carcinoma. And so this patient was found to have this unusual disorder. So when you've got tumours in both adrenal glands and then a malignant tumour in the thyroid, it clicks in and it said, there is something unusual about this.
As I stood at the autopsy table, I knew I was looking at something special, although I did not understand it. I doubted very much that it was a chance occurrence.
And he was right. So when you look at pheochromocytoma, this tumour occurs about 2 to 8 per million. So it's a rare tumour, and then to be in both sides. So again, symptoms with this, you can get hypertension, headache, sweating, palpitations, anxiety. It's because of what the actual tumour is secreting. And then you've got medullary thyroid carcinoma, which only about 3 or 4% of thyroid cancers are medullary. 70% of them are sporadic, so people could just get them, but 20% we know now are familial. And so the problem with the familial one is it tends to be a younger patient and it tends to be more aggressive. So when he did a literature search, he found 537 of these pheochromocytomas, but he only found 5 that also had a medullary or a thyroid cancer association. So he's put this together all in 1961, and he said, this is unusual. There's something, we call it Sipple syndrome now. And so he was able to calculate that the incidence of the thyroid and adrenal gland tumours was out of the order about 15 to 40 times, meaning that this was not just a random occurrence, particularly when you go back and start looking at the literature. And so he then, by 1968, had found 41 other cases and 186 kindred people associated with that. And so when you start to put this all together, you have the genetic puzzle. You have Dr. Paul Wormer from 1954, 1963. He has a family, a father and 4 daughters, ends up being 5 generations and 20 people affected. The incidence we'll discuss a little bit later, but we now know it's called the M.E.N gene. We call it M.E.N. It's a tumor suppressor gene, and you get this loss of regulated growth. It's unregulated growth. And this has caused, 95 to 100% of people get primary hyperparathyroidism. 82% have a pancreatic endocrine tumor, and 60% have a pituitary adenoma. And so, again, looking at that, it's autosomal dominant with a high penetrance, meaning those who have it will show some symptoms or some disease that comes through. But we also know that 20% of patients with MEN1 will have Zollinger-Ellison syndrome. And so that can be a clue that if someone's getting lots of weird ulcers, we need to rule out MEN1. And that takes us back to Dr. Sippel, 1961, MEN2. We have that as the RET gene on chromosome 10, and that's a proto-oncogene gene, and it's a cell signaling pathway. And there's 4 different variants of MEN2. There is MEN2A, and you have 4 variants. One's a skin variant, one's a Hirschsprung disease. Again, it's not really important to go depth into this part, but the interesting part is the case that Dr. John Sippel is describing in 1961 is patients who have pheochromocytoma as well as medullary thyroid carcinoma. So the case that he was reporting, we now know would be MEN2B.
Well, you certainly have laid a puzzle out on the table. I wanted us to ground this now, not in the abstract, but let's talk to someone who is personally linked through his family to this M.E.N. And that's Dr. Mark Lewis, who'll join us from America in just a moment. Dr. Mark A. Lewis received his medical degree, completed his internal medicine residency, and served as chief resident at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas. After completing a hematology oncology fellowship at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, where he served as chief fellow, he returned to Houston to work at the MD Anderson Cancer Center for 4 years, with a dual appointment in general and gastrointestinal medical oncology, before assuming the directorship of gastrointestinal oncology at Intermountain Healthcare in 2016. He serves on the board of directors of the Neuroendocrine Tumor Research Foundation as vice president of American Multiple Endocrine Neoplasia Support, and as co-chair of the Communications Committee for the North American Neuroendocrine Tumor Society. Mark, welcome to This Pathological Life.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a true honor to be on your podcast.
And it's also a true challenge for me with all the names you medical people have and titles.
I think my bio betrays my slight bias and affinity for neuroendocrine tumors, as we'll discuss.
I'm sure we will. In fact, I've done the main bits, but are there some little bits of colour from your past that you'd like to fill us in with, some other aspects of your story that might be useful for our listeners to be aware of?
Certainly, and in fact, it's going to be quite relevant when we talk about how disease surfaced in my family. So I'm Scottish by birth. I was born in Edinburgh and moved to Texas at a young age, which was a bit of culture shock, if I'm honest. But actually, that process was crucial to finding in my own family a neuroendocrine tumor syndrome. And there's a term in medicine, right? Incidentaloma. Finding something almost by accident or by providence, depending on your perspective. And that's exactly what happened in my family.
We actually like to dig a little deeper into your familial background in harmony with the theme that we're exploring in this episode of multiple endocrine neoplasia. Tell us about the personal experience, the familial experience with this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm an open book. I'm happy to talk about my kindred, as it were. So I don't know what the rules are, to be honest with you, regarding immigration to Australia, but when you immigrate to the United States, you have to get a chest x-ray to essentially exclude tuberculosis. Long before COVID, I wanted to make sure that you weren't bringing in a respiratory contagion. And so my father, who at the time was 42 years old and seemingly in fair health, as we can delve into, had his x-ray, which again is essentially a form of screening. And we got this very cold clinical call from the embassy saying, well, good news, bad news. Good news is no signs of tuberculosis. But the bad news is there's something almost entirely pacifying your right lung. And then they hung up. That was the extent of it. And it's funny, as an oncologist, one of the things that we work on, the art of medicine, is breaking bad news. And I've often cited to patients that's sort of the example par excellence of how not to tell somebody
Yes.
they have cancer. And the other thing is, moving from the UK to the US, we then had to engage with American healthcare, which is extremely different and largely privatized. So within a short amount of time after arriving in the States, my dad is having his entire right lung removed. We're putting 30,000 American dollars on credit cards, money that we don't have. And from then on, he was actually never cured of this illness. And frankly, he went to his grave not realizing that this was the manifestation of multiple endocrine neoplasia type 1. It was always described as, pure bad luck. At one point, it was described to him rather incorrectly as an atypical form of lung cancer, which caused him to sort of reflect on all the secondhand smoke exposure he might have had throughout his life and wonder if he had somehow brought this upon himself. In fact, what it was a thymic neuroendocrine tumor, which is one actually of the less known manifestations of M.E.N, as we can discuss. And that grew in his mediastinum, in the anterior part of his chest. And I've actually often described it too as maddeningly vestigial. That's an organ that you don't really need past, say your early adulthood, and yet it grew and ultimately killed him. So that surgery, the pneumonectomy that removed his right lung, first of all, it was a good thing he was in otherwise good health, because he survived on just one lung for 7 years. He called it the slow puffing process of proving its redundancy, which I thought was a lovely turn of phrase. But the surgery didn't entirely remove the tumor, because it was essentially stuck or adhered to the great vessels behind his breastbone. So he got radiation therapy to that. This was the late 80s, and radiation was still fairly crude. And the radiation did collateral damage, particularly to his esophagus, also made it difficult for him to speak. And he was a professor, among other things. He was a professor of theology, and so lecturing became more difficult. And then ultimately, the real tragedy there was it was unsuccessful at eradicating that tumor, which then metastasized to his bones quite painfully. So I saw my teetotal father, who'd never had an intoxicant in his life, require morphine to control bone pain. So I know that sounds like an experience that would drive me away from oncology, but ultimately I found the science really interesting, and I know it sounds cold and clinical. And then the art of oncology too. My father's oncologist was absolutely wonderful, took great compassionate care of him, and then allowed me to work in his practice. And so I grew up in the summertime. My summer job was essentially starting as a medical assistant in an oncology clinic and shadowing this doctor. And it's funny because this physician, he didn't have all the clues he needed to recognize M.E.N in my dad. And so that was left to me when I became an oncologist. It all clicked, and I realized that's what was going on in my family.
I know Travis is dying to get to the microphone, but I need to ask one more question. Before that fateful x-ray, were there any other symptoms that might have alerted everyone to this presence?
Yes, thank you. And actually, it's so crucial we bring this up. So the most penetrant, the most common feature of M.E.N is overactivation of your parathyroid glands, which of course are intimately involved in calcium metabolism and are supposed to very tightly calibrate the rate at which calcium sort of leaches out of your bones into your bloodstream. And so if that process goes even a little bit too fast, you end up, of course, getting osteoporosis, so low bone density, but high blood calcium. And your question is so well posed because in hindsight, and I got a lot of this from my mother posthumously, my father had suffered essentially symptoms of hypercalcemia from probably late adolescence. He was a student at University of St. Andrews and had horrible problems with abdominal pain that in hindsight, I think were probably an ileus or something like it, caused by the high calcium. And that was frankly the crucial clue, because when I was diagnosed with high calcium at age 30, I knew enough at that point. I was pretty far into my medical training. I said, well, there's only a couple conditions actually they're going to give you consecutive generations with high calcium. One of them is entirely benign, familial hypocalciuric hypercalcemia. And the other main one is M.E.N. And that was my eureka moment. I said, oh my goodness, it wasn't just bad luck that befell my father. And as it happens to really fill in the family tree, my paternal grandfather, also a minister, had been kind of a pivotal figure in the Northern Ireland peace process. And he was preaching from the pulpit, and he just became unable to speak, and it was a tumor in his upper chest. And I have to wonder, in hindsight, I don't have details. I think that was probably a thymic neoplasm as well.
Right, it's an amazing story there. Can I ask, when you did find out that moment, how did you feel? Because then you realised that sort of the puzzle all came together about your father and then about yourself. Yeah. How did that make you feel?
I've often described as a patient-physician having a bicameral mind. At that moment, it was really the divide between my head and my heart. I was, I guess, somewhat smug that I'd figured out the puzzle, but then, but then also, realized, wow, this has pretty profound implications for my life and career. And then finally, when I really reflected on it, I sort of just was sad that I couldn't go back and tell my dad and my granddad, this is what was wrong with them, because there's been so much moralization and stigma around cancer. There still is, but certainly, in the 1960s and onward, it was almost the implication that you must have done something wrong. And both those men, they I think suffered an unnecessary amount of guilt and took that to their grave. And that ultimately was the most sort of, sobering reflection I had. But frankly, I also am a huge believer that knowledge is power. I was just starting my subspecialization in oncology when this all came to be, and I wondered, is this going to derail my training and my career? So I went to my fellowship director and immediately confided in him. And he said, well, this shouldn't actually prevent you from working. And in fact, one of the ways our program worked is you were given time to do dedicated research, and very kindly and selfishly for me, I was allowed to do all my research during fellowship on M.E.N. So it was ultimately sort of providential timing. I kind of feel like I was in the right place at the right time, but again, for the generations before me, too little, too late.
Well, I just pick you up. You said selfishly for me, you could do that, but this is one of the rare times when that selfishness actually has a greater good.
Oh, that's very kind of you to say. I mean, it was fascinating. I'll tell you very briefly. I immediately found, of course, I had overactive parathyroid glands. I had those taken care of. And then we'll talk about the mnemonics for M.E.N, but one of the other areas you worry about, of course, is the pancreas. And so I had my pancreas examined with endoscopic ultrasound, and then I was given 3 different surgical opinions. And the spectrum here is very broad. 1, observation. 2, the Whipple surgery. And 3, and least appealingly, total pancreatectomy. And I said, well, gosh, how do we know what to do? And they said, well, it's your choice, and it's kind of what you want to do. And I said, well, there's got to be more evidence here to guide us. And so my research project was I looked at all of the M.E.N. patients that had ever undergone pancreatic surgery at Mayo Clinic, which was a lot. And then I was able to work backwards and see sort of the key predictors for who did well with surgery, what were the real sort of temporal indications for needing operations like those. And that really helped me sort of then guide my own care. So thank you for saying that. It was definitely an opportunity where I hope I benefited others, but I know it helped me manage my own body.
So the challenge with cancer diagnosis initially is one that people get the sort of the shock of it all, and then, okay, how do we go from here? The challenge with M.E.N, though, is it's almost chronic disease cancer.
Yes.
And it's I'm trying to work out how that actually manifests as a patient and then as a doctor. It's sort of one of those ones. How do you manage that condition?
Yes. Oh, gosh, that's so well said. I know you're recording me now, but you must have had a microphone on me earlier today, because I used that exact phrasing, that paradigm of a tumor syndrome as a chronic illness with one of my patients who was really struggling because, well, 2 things that you said there. Number one, when people first come to me, they experience what I call the tinnitus of terror. You say the word cancer, and that's all they hear in the first consultation. So you often have to revisit, facts and prognoses and later visits. But the second thing is almost everybody will ask me, can I be cured? And the truth of the matter is, unless CRISPR or some other gene editing platform comes along, I'm not going to be cured in my lifetime. And that's not woes me, it's my reality, and it actually informs my practice on a daily basis. But I tell my patients, 85% of my patients, and this is outside of just M.E.N, when they come to me as a medical oncologist, I'm sort of the end of a diagnostic sequence by which they've been found to have metastatic or incurable disease. And so that is the case for the majority of the people that I care for. And so I have to kind of have them toggle their mindset pretty early on, actually, from, if a miracle happens, and I've seen miracles happen in my career, I know I didn't bring them about by definition. That's wonderful, but let's hope for the best and plan a little bit more realistically that this is something you're going to have for the rest of your life. And everybody deals with that differently. I will say, and you know this, in the modern oncology era, we are developing therapies that can cure diseases that we previously thought we couldn't render into remission. But this syndrome, at least as we're talking today in 2021, is not one of them.
Then, as you're going through your research and you're finding out more and more about this, I imagine you're in two minds as a physician as well as a sort of a patient investigating these things. How did you feel it actually changed your career at that point in time?
Yeah, I think I call it hard-won empathy. It's made me see specifically our trials, but also our standard of care treatments through a slightly different lens. And I think I'm pretty attuned now to what endpoints matter to patients. We have a lot of surrogates that we have allowed to sort of slip into our work that might seem acceptable to us as clinicians, but at the end of the day, really are not that meaningful. And sometimes are counterproductive for patients. And so the big two, of course, are, overall survival and then quality of life during that longevity. And almost everything else is either a good or a poor surrogate for that. And perhaps the ultimate example in oncology is response rate. We, in our trials, we very rigorously measure lesions on scans, and, we're thrilled if we see, say 30% reduction in cross-sectional area. But, I can't tell you how many times in practice I've walked into a room and, this was pre-COVID. I had a mask off. I don't have a poker face. I'm smiling because I know I'm going to give the patient good news. And sometimes the patients will be like, well, what are you so happy about? I said, oh, your tumors are better on scan. And they're like, well, I don't feel any better. And that kind of disconnect between, what we think is such a great success, but frankly is a bit of a Pyrrhic victory for the patient, especially if they incur toxicity in the process. That is what I think I'm pretty aware of now. And then along that same line, this phrase manageable toxicity has slipped into our lingo. Particularly you hear it at conferences. Someone will be talking about a new drug, and obviously they're incentivized to tell you all the good stuff. And then they'll throw up some slide with a sort of laundry list of horrific toxicities, and they'll call it manageable. And that's just not the right word. It might be something that someone can survive, but I think manageable is sophistry. I think it's used to sell the benefit of drugs while sort of throwing a veil over the adverse effects.
Now, there's a part that you've experienced here. You've experienced it as a son, experienced it as a patient, and now as a father. Can I ask you how that makes you feel? How does that impact you? Because again, when children get in the mix, emotions just get really flipped around. How have you managed that with your children, sort of moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to talk about that as well. So again, I'm a perfect example of autosomal dominant inheritance. So the classic pattern here is that there's a 50-50 chance you're going to transmit the disorder to any one of your children. So literally you're flipping a coin, and I have two kids, a daughter who doesn't have it and a son who does. And it's interesting. We actually found out I had M.E.N between their births. And my wife and I, my wife's a pediatrician, we're given the option of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis before we conceived our son. So, in vitro fertilization plus testing of embryos to see if they are quote unquote defective or not, and then only implanting the ones that aren't deemed defective. For a host of reasons, we opted not to do that. One of which was it almost prompted an existential crisis for me in the sense that if my parents had done that, I wouldn't be here, at least not as I know myself. And so I'm not saying PGD is wrong. I think it probably does fit some parents, especially with much more morbid and fatal disorders than mine. One of the nice things to point out about the syndrome is the reason it propagates is most of us survive to our childbearing years, if you will, and we have reproductive potential. And then, the plus and minus there is then you're going to transmit it to your children, 50-50 chance of each. So honestly, my son motivates me. I'm speaking to you right now from his bedroom.
Yes.
And he, his health, obviously, it almost sounds disingenuous to say, but I'm more invested in his health than I am in my own. I think most parents would say that,
Yep.
you would make sacrifices for your kids. And I'm very motivated to see the field move forward and contribute in some tiny way to him having better health. I mentioned earlier the pancreas. I did end up having the Whipple surgery in 2017. So he watched me go through that at an age where he'll remember it. But I've told him often, I was like, listen, one of the weird things about our condition is, and I don't use this phrase with him, but there's no genotype-phenotype correlation, meaning that one person's experience with exactly the same mutation is going to be very different from another person's. And so I told him, I was like, you may never have to have this operation on your abdomen. He calls it my tummy troubles. I said, that's not actually going to happen in you. I said, it's quite likely at some point we're going to have to fix your neck, referring to the parathyroid, but literally everything else is sort of up in the air. And I'll be honest, there's two ways of looking at that too. Some patients look at that and they're like, gosh, that gives me such uncertainty. On the other hand, I see far too many people assume it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And, my dad died when he was 49, but I know that that's not necessarily, my lot. So it's a very fascinating disease, and again, very different in that respect from M.E.N. which we can talk about as well.
Mark, I feel we've subjected your personal life now under the microscope quite intensely.
Okay.
Let's pause briefly, come back in a moment, and put our clinical focus on.
Certainly.
All right, thanks, Mark. Look, can you give us just some background information about how common M.E.N. is? The different kind of strands as well as the subtypes and everything?
Yes, yeah, exactly. So one of the things to realize is, how these syndromes came about historically, and traditionally they had eponyms associated with them. And as a general rule, I'm not a fan of eponyms because they're not descriptive and they don't really tell you anything about the disease, right? So we'll talk about M.E.N. and then M.E.N. And having just said that, I'm going to contradict myself and say that I actually find the nomenclature a little bit unfortunate because they're very, very different conditions and how they affect patients, and yet they sound so similar and they're very easily confused even by physicians. So we'll start with M.E.N. The incidence, and this is going to vary globally. There are particular kind of hotspots in, say, Scandinavia and Italy, but probably the incidence is something around 1 in 30,000 or even 1 in 50,000. So it definitely qualifies as rare. And it's usually sort of identified or at least memorized in medical school by the 3 Ps. That's the easy mnemonic. All organs neatly arranged in the midline. So the pituitary gland, the parathyroid, and the pancreas. And as I mentioned, the hyperparathyroidism is far and away the most penetrant, such that sometimes people come to me in their 60s and they'll say, do I have M.E.N., and they don't want formal mutation testing. And the very easy litmus test is, do they have hyperparathyroidism or not? And if you've got to your 7th decade and you don't have it, you almost certainly don't have M.E.N. As I mentioned earlier, there is no genotype-phenotype correlation that we know of. So we're interested here in a particular locus in the long arm of chromosome 11. And as of this recording, there's more than 1,000 mutations in that locus that can lead to the M.E.N. phenotype. And my specific mutation actually wasn't even described before 2007. A Swedish database contributed a single patient with my kindred mutation to the testing index, and that's what allowed me to, quote, test positive. I often blame myself for not having seen kind of the pattern sooner. But in truth, if I'd gone and gotten tested even 2 years before I actually did, I would have been told I tested negative. And that's the problem, is we don't know what we don't know. The current estimate is that our mutational testing is roughly 90% sensitive for the syndrome. But again, the denominator there, if you think about it, is really unknown. So that's one thing that's particularly challenging. Now, to shift to M.E.N. here, you're talking about a completely different chromosome. The incidence is very, very similar. But the genotype-phenotype correlation is incredibly strong, so much so that depending on the exon that's mutated now that we're in the RET gene, some patients will actually develop very, very aggressive medullary thyroid cancer in infancy. And this is where I cannot empathize, but I can sympathize with parents of MEN2 affected children, because to be told that your child is going to develop medullary thyroid cancer unless they have their thyroid gland removed in their first year of life, and that's a terrible thing to have to confront. And yet we have that kind of predictive ability with certain exons and codons in the RET gene. And again, the incidence here is probably something like 1 in 35,000. But it has a different phenotype altogether than M.E.N. This is where I'm a little bit, I think it's just a little bit unfortunate they're named so similarly. So the hyperparathyroidism, as it turns out, is actually sort of where the Venn diagram, where the overlap would be. But as I mentioned, there's this horrific predilection for very aggressive medullary thyroid cancer. And so there you're going to see high calcitonin levels and overproliferation of the C cells in the thyroid gland. And then finally, pheochromocytoma is a part of the phenotype, which is crucial to know, because as you can imagine, you can get horrific perioperative complications if you do go operating on the thyroid gland and you don't understand that there's this tendency for catecholamine excess. So M.E.N.2 and M.E.N.2A is what I've just described, looks very, very different than M.E.N.1. And then finally, M.E.N.2B, not to complicate the matter, and sometimes confusingly known as M.E.N.3, actually has a very classic visual phenotype where the patients have a marfanoid habitus. Here in the US, there's actually a really interesting theory that Abraham Lincoln might have had M.E.N.2B. I'm personally a little bit skeptical because, he survived to be assassinated, of course, but he never developed the best of our knowledge medullary thyroid cancer. So I don't know if I believe that. But regardless, people will point to historical pictures of him where he's got these very classic sort of gingival lesions, apparently around his mouth. So frankly, dentists are sometimes the ones that are astute enough to pick up the phenotype of M.E.N.2B. And then finally, not to muddy the waters, but it bears mention, we know that there are some people that have an M.E.N.1-like phenotype, but again, they go through all their very rigorous testing and the M.E.N.1 gene comes back, quote unquote, clean. Now, either that's a false negative or we're looking in the wrong place altogether. So we've realized in about the last decade, there's another syndrome out there, which now has the moniker M.E.N.4. For a while, it was called M.E.N.X. It was essentially almost an umbrella term, again, for M.E.N.1-like syndromes with negative gene testing. And it turns out some of those patients have a mutation on a completely different locus again, which is CDKN1B. So the cyclin-dependent kinase, or one of them. And again, they look more like M.E.N.1 than they do like M.E.N.2. And the reason I bring that up is some patients end up in a real diagnostic quandary where they have some features that are compelling, but then they go and get mutation testing and they're negative. And it's very, very off-putting because they, again, struggle with, well, is the test perfectly sensitive and perfectly able to detect the syndrome? And the answer is no. And I think M.E.N.4 is actually a perfect example of years and years going by where some patients were being told, no, you don't have any M.E.N syndrome. And in fact, they did.
So here's the challenge for doctors, particularly GPs, medical students. I remember going through medical school and coming across M.E.N and going, how do you put together these symptoms to recognize? Because as you said, it is a rare, that statement, if you hear hoofbeats, you look for horses. And the problem is we're talking about zebras here.
Yes.
And so how do we recognize what's probably the key for doctors who generally, someone's walking in, you're not the oncologist who's actually dealing with this, having gone through all the steps. What's the key for people in the general community, general practitioners to sort of be aware of?
Yeah, no, very well said. So I think there's probably two keys. The first actually being taking a good family history. And I don't know if this word has metastasized to Australia, but the one I hate to see in the US medical records, you'll see family history : non-contributory. And frankly, this goes beyond oncology. I mean, unless you're dealing with a hyperacute event, like someone's having an ST elevation MI, it is seldom the case that their family history is non-contributory. And there again, the responsibility to provide that history, I hate to say the onus falls on the patient, but it is on both sides of the exam room table. So the physician has to ask and actually be pretty, I think, probing in terms of detail. So for instance, as was already mentioned, really the key clue in my dad's case was the high calcium, because no one really correctly identified what was happening with his neuroendocrine tumor. And even if they had, it didn't fit the classic 3 Ps mnemonic. So I actually am pretty insistent, especially with my trainees, that you be very meticulous when you take your family history. And then when it comes to cancer, you really, again, have to kind of push. I find it's very, very common here. I'll ask a patient about their relatives and they'll say, oh gosh, I had this one, uncle, and he was so unfortunate because he had colon cancer and he also had liver cancer. And I'll be like, well, hold on a second. Is it possible it was colon cancer that went to the liver? That kind of thing. So that's probably the first thing. And then the second thing is, again, because there are features of both M.E.N. and M.E.N. that are so incredibly penetrant, that the family history will then lead you into identifying kindreds. So as I've mentioned, the big red flag for M.E.N. is consecutive generations with hyperparathyroidism. And if you want to get really granular about it, we're talking multi-gland hyperparathyroidism. Now, most hyperparathyroidism out there is, of course, just one gland going awry. But if you've got 2 generations in a row with high calcium, I really think that that's a massive sort of reason to think about M.E.N. And then with M.E.N. of course, the medullary thyroid cancer. Again, if you dig in enough and you find out, well, gosh, this wasn't your run-of-the-mill, say, papillary thyroid cancer. This was a medullary thyroid cancer, especially with a young onset. I think that's the reason to dig in and think about M.E.N.
Now, just finally, can I ask, patients who have been diagnosed with this, what is there available for them? Is there any, further information, or is there support networks? It's such again, when you go into the rare area, it's such a bit of a challenge. So is there anything that you could advise out there?
Yeah. So you mentioned the zebras, right? Mm. So one of the things that's fascinating is, my story and my dad and granddad before me, the notion of there being this long period of time before the correct diagnosis is absolutely not unique to our family and incredibly common when you dig into the history of neuroendocrine tumors. So one estimate, and of course this is going to vary, is that most patients with these tumors go between 7 and 10 years from time of symptom onset to being correctly labeled. And what I'm getting at is, in the interim, they know something's wrong with them. They might go to their very well-meaning GP, who's likely only going to encounter neuroendocrine tumors, maybe a few times a year, or maybe an M.E.N. syndrome a couple times their career. And if they don't get the right label, but they have this persistent sense that something is off, they tend to self-advocate and they tend to do their own research. Now, we all know that the internet can lead you astray. However, there is a lot of really, really good information. It tends to be curated by other patients who have already been through the experience. So I wouldn't recommend any particular one group to your audience, but I will say that just looking for neuroendocrine support groups, which frankly during COVID have flourished even more online than they used to be in person, is a good thing to do. And good information tends to bubble to the top, especially on social media platforms. And there's very, very active conversation among neuroendocrine tumor patients and advocates online. And so I know it sounds crazy, but in the last decade or so, I've actually come to use Twitter as a tool to curate my own information, because again, there's 200,000 something articles about cancer come out every year. No one can digest the entire peer-reviewed literature. So I look to others to see what they think is important. And again, if I see the same article and the same signal getting boosted again and again, then I know it's probably worth my time. So I know that sounds like a very odd answer to your question, but it's one of the reasons I love NET patients so much, is they are incredibly savvy. Most of the time when they come to me, there's very little actually at that point that I'm teaching them. And then finally, just to point out the therapeutic landscape, I can't help but think of my dad. My dad got very indiscriminate toxicity from a huge operation, fairly primitive radiation, and then very nasty chemo in the late 80s, early 90s. And now, just in the last, certainly since 2009, there have just been therapeutic advances after therapeutic advances for this field, largely honing in on the tumors themselves and trying to leave the patient, the host, alone. So we're really making progress now at a very rapid rate. I think finally, neuroendocrine tumors kind of caught the attention of researchers and also, frankly, the public eye. Both Steve Jobs and Aretha Franklin died from neuroendocrine tumors, not that we know of from M.E.N syndromes, but from NETs. And I know it sounds strange, a celebrity, that one life would generate that kind of interest, but with those two, I really think it has.
Mark, you did make reference to Twitter just before. I do see you and Travis on Twitter. We'll put a link to these things in the show notes, but what is your Twitter handle?
Yeah, it's extremely creative. It's Mark Lewis, MD, so MarkLewis, MD. And one of my favorite communities on there is the neuroendocrine tumor patients, and I think your audience might really enjoy engaging with them.
And do you tweet in a Scottish accent?
Someone actually said that when they read their tweets, they think of the brogue, which I thought was wonderful. I guess anytime we read something, I guess we are kind of repeating it in our head in our own voice.
Dr. Mark Lewis, thanks for taking some time out to chat with us and to help keep making this pathological life such a rich resource.
It was absolutely wonderful. Really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope your listeners get something out of it.
This Pathological Life is produced by ClinPath Pathology in South Australia. Episode notes, references and learning objectives, when applicable, can be found at thispathologicallife.com.au. And you can contact the hosts on Twitter via @DrTravisBrown or @SteveDavis. Thanks again for listening, and just a reminder, if you haven't done it yet, have a quick search in your podcast app for our second series, This Medical Life. Dr. Travis Brown has rolled up some extra guests, some extra topics, and we continue the story there, and we'd love to have you along.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.